Book 1, chapters 27 and 28 of the Wars of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wars of the Jews by Josephus. Translated by William Whiston. Book 1, chapters 27 and 28. Chapters 27. Herod, by Caesar's direction, accuses his sons at Eurytus. They are not produced before the courts, but yet are condemned, and in a little time they are sent to Sebaste and strangled there. Moreover, Salome exasperated Herod's cruelty against his sons, for Aristobulus was desirous to bring her, who was his mother-in-law and his aunt, into the like dangers with themselves. So he sent to her to take care of her own safety, and told her that the king was preparing to put her to death, on account of the accusation that was laid against her, as if when she formerly endeavored to marry herself to Salius the Arabian, she had discovered the king's grand secrets to him, who was the king's enemy, and this it was that came as the last storm, and entirely sunk the young men when they were in great danger before. For Salome came running to the king, and informed him of what admonition had been given her. Whereupon he could bear no longer, but commanded both the young men to be bound, and kept the one asunder from the other. He also sent Volumnius, the general of his army, to Caesar immediately, as also his friend Olympus with him, who carried the informations in writing along with them. Now as soon as they had sailed to Rome, and delivered the king's letters to Caesar, Caesar was mightily troubled at the case of the young men. Yet he did not think he ought to take power from the father of condemning his sons. So he wrote back to him, and appointed him to have the power over his sons, but said withal that he would do well to make an examination into this matter of the plot against him in a public court, and to take for his successors his own kindred, and the governors of the province. If those sons be found guilty, to put them to death. But if they appear to have thought of no more than flying away from him, that he should moderate their punishment. With these directions Herod complied, and came to Berytus, where Caesar had ordered the court to be assembled, and got the judicature together. The presidents sat first, as Caesar's letters had appointed, who were Saturninus and Pedanius, and their lieutenants that were with them, with whom was the procurator Volumnius also. Next to them sat the king's kinsmen and friends, with Salome also, and Pheroras, after whom sat the principal men of all Syria, excepting Archelaus, for Herod had a suspicion of him, because he was Alexander's father-in-law. Yet he did not produce his sons in open court, and this was done very cunningly, for he knew well enough that had they but appeared only, they would certainly have been pitied, and if withal they were suffered to speak, Alexander could have easily answered what they were accused of. But they were in custody at Platane, a village of the Sidonians. So the king got up and inveighed against his sons, as if they were present, and as for that part of the accusation that they had plotted against him, he urged it but faintly, because he was destitute of proofs, but he insisted before the assessors on their reproaches, and jests, and injurious carriage, and 10,000 the like offenses against him, which were heavier than death itself. And when nobody contradicted him, he moved them to pity his case, as though he had been condemned himself. Now he had gained a bitter victory against his sons. So he asked every one's sentence, which sentence was first of all given by Saturninus, and was this: that he condemned the young men, but not to death, for that was not fit for them, who had 3 sons of his own now present, to give his vote for the destruction of the sons of another. The 2 lieutenants also gave the like vote, and some others there were also who followed their example. But Volumnius began to vote on the more melancholy side, and all those that came after him condemned the young men to die, some out of flattery, and some out of hatred to Herod, but none out of indignation at their crimes. And now all Syria and Judea was in great expectation, and waited for the last act of this tragedy. Yet did nobody, supposed that Herod would be so barbarous as to murder his children. However, he carried them away to Tyre, and thence sailed to Caesarea, and deliberated with himself what sort of death the young men should suffer. Now there was a certain old soldier of the king's, whose name was Tero, who had a son that was very familiar with and a friend to Alexander, and who himself particularly loved the young men. This soldier was in a manner distracted, out of the excess of the indignation he had at what he was doing, and at first he cried out aloud, as he went about, that justice was trampled under foot, that truth was perished, and nature confounded, and that the life of man was full of iniquity, and everything else that passion could suggest to a man who had spared not his own life. And at last he ventured to go to the king, and said, "Truly, I think thou art a most miserable man, when thou hearkenest to the most wicked wretches, against those that ought to be the dearest to thee, since thou hast frequently resolved that Pheroras and Salome should be put to death, and yet believest them against thy sons, while these, by cutting off the succession of thine own sons, leave all wholly to Antipater, and thereby choose to have thee such a king as may be thoroughly in their own power. However, consider whether this death of Antipater's brethren will not make him hated by the soldiers. For there is nobody but commiserates the young men, and of the captains a great many show their indignation at it openly." Upon his saying this, he named those that had such indignation. But the king ordered those men, with Tero himself and his son, to be seized upon immediately. At which time there was a certain barber, whose name was Trypho. This man leaped out from among the people in a kind of madness, and accused himself, saying, "This Tero endeavored to persuade me also to cut thy throat with my razor, when I trimmed thee, and promised that Alexander should give me large presents for so doing." When Herod heard this, he examined Tero, with his son and the barber, by the torture; but as the others denied the accusation, he said nothing further. Herod gave order that Tero should be racked most severely, but his son, out of pity to his father, promised to discover the whole to the king, if he would grant that his father should no longer be tortured. When he had agreed to this, he said that his father, at the persuasion of Alexander, had an intention to kill him. Now some said this was forged, in order to free his father from his torments, and some said that it was true. And now Herod accused the captains and Tero in an assembly of the people, and he brought the people together in a body against them. And accordingly they were put to death, together with Trypho the barber. They were killed by the pieces of wood and stones that were thrown at them. He also sent his sons to Sebaste, a city not far from Caesarea, and ordered them there strangled. And as what he had ordered was executed immediately, so he commanded that their dead bodies should be brought to the fortress Alexandrium, to be buried with Alexander their grandfather by the mother's side. And this was the end of Alexander and Aristobulus. Chapter 28. How Antipater is hated of all men, and how the king espouses the sons of those who had been slain to his kindred, but that Antipater made him change them for other women. Of Herod's marriages and children. But an intolerable hatred fell upon Antipater from the nation, though he had now an indisputable title to the succession, because they all knew that he was the person who contrived all the calumnies against his brethren. However, he began to be in a terrible fear, as he saw the posterity of those who had been slain growing up. For Alexander had two sons by Glaphyra, Tigranes and Alexander, and Aristobulus had Herod and Agrippa, and Aristobulus his sons, with Herodias and Mariamne, his daughters, and all by Bernice, Salome's daughter. As for Glaphyra, Herod, as soon as he had killed Alexander, sent her back, together with her portion, to Cappadocia. He married Bernice, Aristobulus's daughter, to Antipater's uncle by his mother, and it was Antipater who, in order to reconcile her to him when she had been at variance with him, contrived this match. He also got into Pheroras's favor, and into the favor of Caesar's friends, by presents and other ways of obsequiousness, and sent no small sums of money to Rome. Saturninus also, and his friends in Syria, were all well replenished with the presents he made them. Yet the more he gave, the more he was hated, as not making these presents out of generosity, but spending his money out of fear. Accordingly it so fell out that the receivers bore him no more good will than before, but that those to whom he gave nothing were his more bitter enemies. However, he bestowed his money every day more and more profusely, on observing that, contrary to his expectations, the king was taking care about the orphans, and discovering at the same time his repentance for killing their fathers, by his commiseration of those that sprang from them. Accordingly Herod got together his kindred and friends, and set before them the children, and, with his eyes full of tears, said thus to them: "It was an unlucky fate that took away from me these children's fathers, which children are recommended to me by their natural commiseration which their orphan condition requires. However, I will endeavor, though I have been a most unfortunate father, to appear a better grandfather, and to leave these children such curators after myself as are dearest to me. I therefore betroth thy daughter, Pheroras, to the elder of these brethren, the children of Alexander, that thou mayest be obliged to take care of them. I also betroth thy son, Antipater, to the daughter of Aristobulus. Be thou therefore a father to that orphan. And my son Herod Philip shall have her sister, whose grandfather by the mother's side was high priest. And let every one that loves me be of my sentiments in these dispositions, which none that hath an affection for me will abrogate. And I pray God that he will join these children together in marriage to the advantage of my kingdom and of my posterity, and may he look down with eyes more serene upon them than he looked upon their fathers." While he spake these words he wept, and joined the children's right hands together. After which he embraced them every one after an affectionate manner, and dismissed the assembly. Upon this Antipater was in great disorder immediately, and lamented publicly at what was done. For he supposed that his dignity, which was conferred on these orphans, was for his own destruction, even in his father's lifetime, and that he should run another risk of losing the government, if Alexander's son should have both Archelaus, a king, and Pheroras, a tetrarch, to support them. He also considered how he was himself hated by the nation, and how they pitied these orphans, how great affection the Jews bare to those brethren of his when they were alive, and how gladly they remembered them now that they had perished by his means. So he resolved by all the ways possible to get these espousals dissolved. Now he was afraid of going subtly about the matter with his father, who was hard to be pleased, and was presently moved upon the least suspicion. So he ventured to go to him directly, and to beg of him before his face not to deprive him of that dignity which he had been pleased to bestow upon him, and that he might not have the bare name of a king, while the power was in another person's. For that he should never be able to keep the government, if Alexander's son was to have both his grandfather Archelaus and Pheroras for his curators. And he besought him earnestly, since there was so many of the royal family alive, that he would change those intended marriages. Now the king had 9 wives. Dean Aldrich takes notice here that these 9 wives of Herod were alive at the same time, and that if the celebrated Mariamne, who is now dead, be reckoned, those wives were in all 10. Yet it is remarkable that he had no more than 15 children by them all. And children by 7 of them. Antipater was himself born of Doris, and Herod Philip of Mariamne, the high priest's daughter. Antipas also and Archelaus were by Malthace the Samaritan, as was his daughter Olympias, which his brother Joseph's son had married. To prevent confusion, it may not be amiss with Dean Aldrich to distinguish between the 4 Josephs in the history of Herod. 1. Joseph, Herod's uncle, and the second husband of his sister Salome, slain by Herod on account of a Mariamne. 2. Joseph, Herod's quaestor, or treasurer, slain on the same account. 3. Joseph, Herod's brother, slain in battle against Antigonus. 4. Joseph, Herod's nephew, the husband of Olympias, mentioned in this place. By Cleopatra of Jerusalem he had Herod and Philip. By Pallas, Pharsalius. He had also 2 daughters, Roxana and Salome, the one by Phaedra, the other by Elpis. He had also 2 wives that had no children, the one his first cousin, and the other his niece. And besides these he had 2 daughters, the sisters of Alexander and Aristobulus by Mariamne. Since therefore the royal family was so numerous, Antipater prayed him to change these intended marriages. When the king perceived what disposition he was in towards these orphans, he was angry at it, and a suspicion came into his mind as to those sons whom he had put to death, whether they had not been brought about by the false tales of Antipater. And so at that time he made Antipater a long and peevish answer, and bid him begone. Yet he was afterwards prevailed upon cunningly by his flatteries, and changed the marriages. He married Aristobulus's daughter to him, and his son to Pheroras's daughter. Now one may learn in this instance how very much this flattering Antipater could do, even what Salome in the like circumstances could not do. For when she, who was his sister, and who, by the means of Julia, Caesar's wife, earnestly desired leave to be married to Silius the Arabian, Herod swore that he would esteem her his bitter enemy unless she would leave off that project. He also caused her, against her own consent, to be married to Alexis, a friend of his, and that one of her daughters should be married to Alexis's son, and the other to Antipater's uncle by the mother's side. And for the daughters the king had by Mariamne, the one was married to Antipater, his sister's son, and the other to his brother's son, Phasaelus. End of Book 1, chapters 27 and 28.
Book 1, chapters 29 and 30 of the Wars of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wars of the Jews by Josephus. Translated by William Whiston. Book 1, chapters 29 and 30. Chapter 29. Antipater becomes intolerable. He is sent to Rome, and carries Herod's testament with him. Pheroras leaves his brother, that he may keep his wife. He dies at home. Now when Antipater had cut off the hopes of the orphans, and had contracted such affinities as would be most for his own advantage, he proceeded briskly, as having a certain expectation of the kingdom. And as he had now assurance added to his wickedness, he became intolerable, for not being able to avoid the hatred of all people, he built his security upon the terror he struck into them. Pheroras also assisted him in his designs, looking upon him as already fixed in the kingdom. There was also a company of women in the court, which excited new disturbances, for Pheroras's wife, together with her mother and sister, as also Antipater's mother, grew very impudent in the palace. She also was so insolent as to affront the king's 2 daughters. [Footnote: These daughters of Herod, whom Pheroras's wife affronted, were Salome and Roxana, 2 virgins, who were born to him of his 2 wives, Elphide and Phaedra. On which account the king hated her to a great degree. Yet although these women were hated by him, they domineered over others. There was only Salome who opposed their good agreement, and informed the king of their meetings, as not being for the advantage of his affairs. And when those women knew what calumnies she had raised against them, and how much Herod was displeased, they left off their public meetings, and friendly entertainments of one another. Nay, on the contrary, they pretended to quarrel one with another while the king was within hearing. The like dissimulation did Antipater make use of, and when matters were public, he opposed Pheroras, but still they had private cabals and merry meetings in the night time. Nor did the observation of others do any more than confirm their mutual agreement. However, Salome knew everything they did, and told everything to Herod. But he was inflamed with anger at them, and chiefly at Pheroras's wife, for Salome had principally accused her. So he got an assembly of his friends and kindred together, and there accused this woman of many things, and particularly of the affronts she had offered his daughters, and that she had supplied the Pharisees with money, by way of rewards for what they had done against him, and had procured his brother to become his enemy by giving him love potions. At length he turned his speech to Pheroras, and told him that he would give him his choice of these two things, whether he would keep in with his brother, or with his wife. And when Pheroras said that he would die rather than forsake his wife, Herod, not knowing what to do further in that matter, turned his speech to Antipater, and charged him to have no intercourse, either with Pheroras's wife, or with Pheroras himself, or with any one belonging to her. Now, though Antipater did not transgress that his injunction publicly, yet did he in secret come to their night meetings, and because he was afraid that Salome observed what he did, he procured, by the means of his Italian friends, so that he might go and live at Rome. For when they wrote that it was proper for Antipater to be sent to Caesar for some time, Herod made no delay, but sent him, and that with a splendid attendance, and a great deal of money, and gave him his testament to carry with him, wherein Antipater had the kingdom bequeathed to him, and wherein Herod was named for Antipater's successor, that Herod, I mean, who was the son of Mariamne, the high priest's daughter. Sylleus also, the Arabian, sailed to Rome, without any regard to Caesar's injunctions, and this in order to oppose Antipater with all his might, as to that lawsuit which Nicolaus had with him before. This Sylleus had a great contest with Aretas his own king, for he had slain many others of Aretas's friends, and particularly Sohemus, the most potent man in the city Petra. Moreover, he had prevailed with Phabatus, who was Herod's steward, by giving him a great sum of money, to assist him against Herod. But when Herod gave him more, he induced him to leave Silchus, and by this means he demanded of him all that Caesar had required of him to pay. But when Sylleus paid nothing of what he was to pay, and did also accuse Phabatus to Caesar, and said that he was not a steward for Caesar's advantage, but for Herod's, Phabatus was angry at him on that account, but was still in very great esteem with Herod, and discovered Sylleus's grand secrets, and told the king that Sylleus had corrupted Corinthus, one of the guards of his body, by bribing him, and of whom he must therefore have a care. Accordingly, the king complied, for this Corinthus, though he was brought up in Herod's kingdom, yet he was by birth an Arabian, so the king ordered him to be taken up immediately, and not only him, but 2 other Arabians, who were caught with him, the one of them was Sylleus's friend, the other the head of a tribe. These last, being put to the torture, confessed that they had prevailed with Corinthus, for a large sum of money, to kill Herod, and when they had been further examined before Saturninus, the president of Syria, they were sent to Rome. However, Herod did not leave off importuning Pheroras, but proceeded to force him to put away his wife. [Footnote: This strange obstinacy of Pheroras in retaining his wife, who was one of a low family, and refusing to marry one nearly related to Herod, though he so earnestly desired it, as also that wife's admission to the councils of the other great court ladies, together with Herod's own importunity as to Pheroras's divorce and other marriage, all so remarkable here, be well accounted for, but on the supposal that Pheroras believed, and Herod suspected, that the Pharisees' prediction, as if the crown of Judea should be translated from Herod to Pheroras's posterity, and that most probably to Pheroras's posterity by this his wife also would prove true. Yet he could not devise any way by which he could bring the woman herself to punishment, though he had many causes of hatred to her, till at length he was in such great uneasiness at her, that he cast both her and his brother out of his kingdom. Pheroras took this inquiry very patiently, and went away into his own tetrarchy, Perea, beyond Jordan, and sware that there should be but one end put to his flight, and that should be Herod's death, and that he would never return while he was alive. Nor indeed would he return when his brother was sick, although he earnestly sent for him to come to him, because he had a mind to leave some injunctions with him before he died, but Herod unexpectedly recovered. A little afterward Pheroras himself fell sick, when Herod showed a great moderation, for he came to him, and pitied his case, and took care of him; but his affection did him no good, for Pheroras died a little afterward. Now, though Herod had so great an affection for him to the last day of his life, yet was a report spread abroad that he had killed him by poison. However, he took care to have his dead body carried to Jerusalem, and appointed a very great mourning to the whole nation for him, and bestowed a most pompous funeral upon him. And this was the end that one of Alexander's and Aristobulus's murderers came to. Chapter 30. When Herod made inquiry about Pheroras's death, a discovery was made, that Antipater had prepared a poisonous draught for him. Herod cast Doris and her accomplices, as also Mariamne, out of the palace, and blots her son Herod out of his testament. But now the punishment was transferred unto the original author, Antipater, and took its rise from the death of Pheroras. For certain of his freedmen came with a sad countenance to the king, and told him that his brother had been destroyed by poison, and that his wife had brought him somewhat that was prepared after an unusual manner, and that upon his eating it, he presently fell into his distemper; that Antipater's mother and sister, 2 days before, brought a woman out of Arabia that was skillful in mixing such drugs, that she might prepare a love potion for Pheroras, and that instead of a love potion, she had given him deadly poison, and that this was done by the management of Sylleus, who was acquainted with that woman. The king was deeply affected with so many suspicions, and had the maidservants and some of the free women also tortured, one of which cried out in her agonies, "May that God that governs the earth and the heaven punish this author of all these our miseries, Antipater's mother." The king took a handle from this confession, and proceeded to inquire further into the truth of the matter. So this woman discovered the friendship of Antipater's mother to Pheroras, and Antipater's woman, as also their secret meetings, and that Pheroras and Antipater had drunk with them for a whole night together, as they returned from the king, and would not suffer anybody, either manservant or maidservant, to be there, while one of the free women discovered the matter. Upon this Herod tortured the maidservants every one by themselves separately, who all unanimously agreed in the foregoing discoveries, and that accordingly by agreement they went away, Antipater to Rome, and Pheroras to Perea; for that they oftentimes talked one another thus, that after Herod had slain Alexander and Aristobulus, he would fall upon them, and upon their wives, because after he, Mariamne, and her children, he would spare nobody; and that for this reason it was best to get as far off the wild beast as they were able; and that Antipater oftentimes lamented his own case before his mother, and said to her, that he had already grey hairs upon his head, and that his father grew younger again every day, and that perhaps death would overtake him before he should begin to be king in earnest, and that in case Herod should die, which yet nobody knew when it would be, the enjoyment of the succession would certainly be but for a little time; for that these heads of Hydra, the sons of Alexander and Aristobulus, were growing up, that he was deprived by his father of the hopes of being succeeded by his children, for that his successor after his death was not to be any one of his own sons, but Herod the son of Mariamne; that in this point Herod was plainly distracted, to think that his testament should therein take place, for he would take care that not one of his posterity should remain, because he was of all fathers the greatest hater of his children. Yet does he hate his brother still worse, whence it was that he a while ago gave himself 100 talents, that he should not have any intercourse with Pheroras. And when Pheroras said, "Wherein have we done him any harm?" Antipater replied, "I wish he would but deprive us of all we have, and leave us naked and alive only; but it is indeed impossible to escape this wild beast, who is thus given to murder, who will not permit us to love any person openly, though we be together privately; yet may we be so openly too, if we have but the courage and the hands of men." These things were said by the women upon the torture, as also that Pheroras resolved to fly with them to Perea. Now Herod gave credit to all they said, on account of the affair of the 100 talents, for he had no discourse with anybody about them, but only with Antipater. So he vented his anger first of all against Antipater's mother, and took away from her all the ornaments which he had given her, which cost a great many talents, and cast her out of the palace a second time. He also took care of Pheroras's women after their tortures, as being now reconciled to them; but he was in great consternation himself, and inflamed upon every suspicion, and had many innocent persons led to the torture, out of his fear lest he should leave any guilty person untortured. And now it was that he betook himself to examine Antipater of Samaria, who was the steward of his son Antipater; and upon torturing him, he learned that Antipater had sent for a potion of deadly poison for him out of Egypt, by Antiphilus, a companion of his; that Theudio, the uncle of Antipater, had it from him, and delivered it to Pheroras; for that Antipater had charged him to take his father off while he was at Rome, and so free him from the suspicion of doing it himself; that Pheroras also committed this potion to his wife. Then did the king send for her, and bid her bring to him what she had received immediately. So she came out of her house as if she would bring it with her, but threw herself down from the top of the house, in order to prevent any examination and torture from the king. However, it came to pass, as it seems by the providence of God, when he intended to bring Antipater to punishment, that she fell not upon her head, but upon other parts of her body, and escaped. The king, when she was brought to him, took care of her, for she was at first quite senseless upon her fall, and asked her why she had thrown herself down, and gave her his oath, that if she would speak the real truth, he would excuse her from punishment; but that if she concealed anything, he would have her body torn to pieces by torments, and leave no part of it to be buried. Upon this the woman paused a little, and then said, "Why do I spare to speak of these grand secrets, now Pheroras is dead? That would only tend to save Antipater, who is all our destruction. Hear then, O king, and be thou, and God himself, who cannot be deceived, witnesses to the truth of what I am going to say. When thou didst sit weeping by Pheroras as he was dying, then it was that he called me to him, and said, My dear wife, I have been greatly mistaken as to the disposition of my brother towards me, and have hated him that is so affectionate to me, and have contrived to kill him who is in such disorder for me before I am dead. As for myself, I receive the recompense of my impiety, but do thou bring what poison was left with us by Antipater, and which thou keepest in order to destroy him, and consume it immediately in the fire in my sight, that I may not be liable to the avenger in the invisible world. This I brought as he bid me, and emptied the greatest part of it into the fire, but reserved a little of it for my own use against an uncertain futurity, and out of my fear of thee." When she had said this, she brought the box, which had a small quantity of this potion in it; but the king let her alone, and transferred the tortures to Antiphilus's mother and brother, who both confessed that Antiphilus brought the box out of Egypt, and that they had received the potion from a brother of his, who was a physician at Alexandria. Then did the ghosts of Alexander and Aristobulus go round all the palace, and become the inquisitors and discoverers of what could not otherwise have been found out, and brought such as were the freest from suspicion to be examined; whereby it was discovered that Mariamne, the high priest's daughter, was conscious of this plot, and her very brothers, when they were tortured, declared it so to be. Whereupon the king avenged this insolent attempt of the mother upon her son, and blotted Herod, whom he had by her, out of his treatment, who had been before named therein a successor to Antipater. End of Book 1, chapters 29 and 30. Book 1, chapters 31 and 32 of the Wars of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wars of the Jews by Josephus. Translated by William Whiston. Book 1, chapters 31 and 32. Chapter 31. Antipater is convicted by Bathyllus, but he still returns from Rome without knowing it. Herod brings him to his trial. After these things were over, Bathyllus came under examination, in order to convict Antipater, who proved the concluding attestation to Antipater's designs, for indeed he was no other than his freedman. This man came, and brought another deadly potion, the poison of asps, and the juices of other serpents, that if the first potion did not do the business, Pheroras and his wife might be armed with this also to destroy the king. He brought also an addition to Antipater's insolent attempt against his father, which was the letters which he wrote, against his brethren, Archelaus and Philip, which were the king's sons, and educated at Rome, being yet youths, but of generous dispositions. Antipater set himself to get rid of these as soon as he could, that they might not be prejudicial to his hopes, and to that end he forged letters against them in the name of his friends at Rome. Some of these he corrupted by bribes to write how they grossly reproached their father, and did openly bewail Alexander and Aristobulus, and were uneasy at their being recalled, for their father had already sent for them, which was the very thing that troubled Antipater. Nay, indeed, while Antipater was in Judea, and before he was upon his journey to Rome, he gave money to have the like letters against them sent from Rome, and then came to his father, who as yet had no suspicion of him, and apologized for his brethren, and alleged on their behalf that some of the things contained in those letters were false, and others of them were only youthful errors. Yet at the same time that he expended a great deal of his money, by making presents to such as wrote against his brethren, did he aim to bring his accounts into confusion, by buying costly garments, and carpets of various contextures, with silver and gold cups, and a great many more curious things, that so, among the few great expenses laid out upon such furniture, he might conceal the money he had used in hiring men, to write the letters, for he brought in an account of his expenses, amounting to 200 talents, his main pretense for which was file lawsuit he had been in with Sylleus. So while all his rogueries, even those of a lesser sort also, were covered by his greater villainy, while all the examinations by torture proclaimed his attempt to murder his father, and the letters proclaimed his second attempt to murder his brethren, yet did no one of these that came to Rome inform him of his misfortunes in Judea, although 7 months had intervened between his conviction and his return, so great was the hatred which they all bore to him. And perhaps they were the ghosts of those brethren of his that had been murdered that stopped the mouths of those that intended to have told him. He then wrote from Rome, and informed his friends that he would soon come to them, and how he was dismissed with honor by Caesar. Now the king, being desirous to get this plotter against him into his hands, and being also afraid lest he should some way come to the knowledge how his affairs stood, and be upon his guard, he dissembled his anger in his epistle to him, as in other points he wrote kindly to him, and desired him to make haste, because if he came quickly, he would then lay aside the complaints he had against his mother, for Antipater was not ignorant that his mother had been expelled out of the palace. However, he had before received a letter, which contained an account of the death of Pheroras at Tarentum. [Footnote: This Tarentum has coins still extant, as Reland informs us here in his note.] and made great lamentations at it, for which some commended him, as being for his own uncle, though probably this confusion arose on account of his having thereby failed in his plot, on his father's life, and his tears were more for the loss of him that was to have been a subservient therein, than for an uncle, Pheroras. Moreover, a sort of fear came upon him as to his designs, lest the poison should have been discovered. However, when he was in Cilicia, he received the aforementioned epistle from his father, and made great haste accordingly. But when he had sailed to Cylindrus, a suspicion came into his mind relating to his mother's misfortunes, as if his soul foreboded some mischief to itself. Those therefore of his friends which were the most considerate advised him not rashly to go to his father, till he had learned what were the occasions why his mother had been ejected, because they were afraid that he might be involved in the calumnies that had been cast upon his mother. But those that were less considerate, and had more regard to their own desires of seeing their native country than to Antipater's safety, persuaded him to make haste home, and not, by delaying his journey, afford his father ground for an ill suspicion, and give a handle to those that raised stories against him; for in that case anything which had been moved to his disadvantage, it was owing to his absence, which durst not have been done had he been present. And they said it was absurd to deprive himself of certain happiness, for the sake of an uncertain suspicion, and not return to his father, and take the royal authority upon him, which was in a state of fluctuation on his account only. Antipater complied with this last advice, for Providence hurried him on to his destruction. So he passed over the sea, and landed at Sebastus, the haven of Caesarea. And here he found a perfect and unexpected solitude, while everybody avoided him, and nobody durst come at him, for he was equally hated by all men. And now that hatred had liberty to show itself, and the dread men were in at the king's anger made men keep from him, for the whole city of Jerusalem was filled with the rumors about Antipater, and Antipater himself was the only person who was ignorant of them, for as no man was dismissed more magnificently when he began his voyage to Rome, so was no man now received back with greater ignominy. And indeed he began already to suspect what misfortunes there were in Herod's family, yet did he cunningly conceal his suspicion, and while he was inwardly ready to die for fear, he put on a forced boldness of countenance. Nor could he fly any whither, nor had he any way of emerging out of the difficulties which encompassed him. Nor indeed had he even there any certain intelligence of the affairs of the royal family, by reason of the threats the king had given out. Yet had he some small hopes of better tidings, for perhaps nothing had been discovered, or, if any discovery had been made, perhaps he should be able to clear himself by impudence and artful tricks, which were the only things he relied upon for his deliverance. And with these hopes did he screen himself, till he came to the palace, without any friends with him, for these were affronted, and shut out at the first gate. Now Varus, the president of Syria, happened to be in the palace at this juncture, so Antipater went in to his father, and putting on a bold face, he came near to salute him. But Herod stretched out his hands, and turned his head away from him, and cried out, "Even this is an indication of a parricide, to be desirous to get me into his arms, when he is under such heinous accusations. God confound thee, thou vile wretch! Do not touch me, till thou hast cleared thyself of these crimes that are charged upon thee. I appoint thee a court where thou art to be judged, and this Varus, who is very seasonably here, to be thy judge, and get thou thy defense ready against tomorrow, for I give thee so much time to prepare suitable excuses for thyself." And as Antipater was so confounded, that he was able to make no answer to this charge, he went away, but his mother and wife came to him, and told him of all the evidence they had gotten against him. Hereupon he recollected himself, and considered what defense he should make against the accusations. Chapter 32. Antipater is accused before Varus, and is convicted of laying a plot against his father by the strongest evidence. Herod puts off his punishment till he should be recovered, and in the meantime alters his testament. Now the day following, the king assembled a court of his kinsmen and friends, and called in Antipater's friends also. Herod himself with Varus were the presidents, and Herod called for all the witnesses, and ordered them to be brought in, among whom some of the domestic servants of Antipater's mother were brought in also, who had but a little while before been caught as they were carrying the following letter from her to her son. "Since all those things have been already discovered to thy father, do not thou come to him, unless thou canst procure some assistance from Caesar." When this and the other witnesses were introduced, Antipater came in, and falling on his face before his father's feet, he said, "Father, I beseech thee, do not condemn me beforehand, but let thy ears be unbiased, and attend to my defense, for if thou wilt give me leave, I will demonstrate that I am innocent." Hereupon Herod cried out to him to hold his peace, and spake thus to Varus: "I cannot but think that thou, Varus, and every other upright judge, will determine that Antipater is a vile wretch. I am also afraid that thou wilt abhor my ill fortune, and judge me also myself worthy of all sorts of calumny for begetting such children. Yet while I ought rather to be pitied, who have been so affectionate a father to such wretched sons, for when I had settled a kingdom on my former sons, even when they were young, and when, besides the charges of their education at Rome, I had made them the friends of Caesar, and made them envied by other kings, I found them plotting against me. These have been put to death, and that in great measure for the sake of Antipater, for, as he was then young and appointed to be my successor, I took care chiefly to secure him from danger. But this profligate wild beast, when he had been over and above satiated with that patience which I showed him, he made use of that abundance I had given him against myself, for I seemed to him to live too long, and he was very uneasy at the old age I was arrived at, nor could he stay any longer, but would be a king by parricide. and justly I am served by him for bringing him back out of the country to court, when he was of no esteem before, and for thrusting out those sons of mine that were born of the queen, and for making him a successor to my dominions. I confess to thee, O Varus, the great folly I was guilty, for I provoked those sons of mine to act against me, and cut off their just expectations for the sake of Antipater. And, indeed, what kindness did I do them, that could equal what I have done to Antipater? I have in a manner yielded up my royal while I am alive, and whom I have openly named for the successor to my dominions in my testament, and given him a yearly revenue of his own of 50 talents, and supplied him with money to an extravagant degree out of my own revenue. And when he was about to sail to Rome, I gave him 3 talents, and recommended him, and him alone of all my children, to Caesar, as his father's deliverer. Now what crimes were those other sons of mine guilty of like these of Antipater? And what evidence was there brought against them so strong as there is to demonstrate this son to have plotted against me? Yet does this parricide presume to speak for himself, and hopes to obscure the truth by his cunning tricks. Thou, O Varus, must guard thyself against him, for I know the wild beast, and I foresee how plausibly he will talk, and his counterfeit lamentation. This was he who exhorted me to have a care of Alexander when he was alive, and not to entrust my body with all men. This was he who came to my very bed, and looked about lest any one should lay snares for me. This was he who took care of my sleep, and secured me from fear of danger, who comforted me under the trouble I was in, upon the slaughter of my sons, and looked to see what affection my surviving brethren bore me. This was my protector, and the guardian of my body. And when I call to mind, O Varus, his craftiness upon every occasion, and his art of dissembling, I can hardly believe that I am still alive, and wonder how I have escaped such a deep plotter of mischief. However, since some fate or other makes my house desolate, and perpetually raises up those that are dearest to me against me, I will with tears lament my hard fortune, and privately groan under my lonesome condition. Yet I am resolved that no one who thirsts after my blood shall escape punishment, although the evidence should extend itself to all my sons." Upon Herod's saying this, he was interrupted by the confusion he was in, but ordered Nicolaus, one of his friends, to produce the evidence against Antipater. But in the meantime Antipater lifted up his head, for he lay on the ground before his father's feet, and cried out aloud, "O, thou father, hast made my apology for me, for how can I be a parricide, whom thou thyself confessest to have always had for thy guardian? Thou callest my filial affections prodigious lies and hypocrisy. Then how could it be that I, who was so subtle in other matters, should here be so mad as not to understand that it was not easy that he who committed so horrid a crime should be concealed from men, but impossible that he should be concealed from the Judge of heaven, who sees all things, and is present everywhere? Or did I not know what end my brethren came to, on whom God inflicted so great a punishment for their evil designs against thee? And indeed, what was there that could possibly provoke me against thee? Could the hope of being king do it? I was king already. Could I suspect hatred from thee? No. Was I not beloved by thee? And what other fear could I have? Nay, by preserving thee safe, I was a terror to others. Did I want money? No, for who was able to expend so much as myself? Indeed, father, had I been the most execrable of all mankind, and had I had the soul of the most cruel wild beast, must I not have been overcome with the benefits thou hadst bestowed upon me? Whom, as thou thyself sayest, thou broughtest into the palace, whom thou didst prefer before so many of thy sons, whom thou madest a king in thine own lifetime, and, by the vast magnitude of the other advantages thou bestowed upon me, thou madest me an object of envy. O miserable man, that thou shouldst undergo this bitter absence, and thereby afford a great opportunity for envy to arise against thee, and a long space for such as were laying designs against thee. Yet was I absent, father, on thy affairs, that Sylleus might not treat thee with contempt in thine old age. Rome is a witness to my filial affection, and so is Caesar, the ruler of the habitable earth, who oftentimes called me Philopater. [Footnote: A lover of his father.] Take here the letters he had sent thee. They are more to be believed than the calumnies raised here. These letters are my only apology. These I use as the demonstration of that natural affection I have to thee. Remember that it was against my own choice that I sailed to Rome, as knowing the latent hatred that was in the kingdom against me. It was thou, O father, however unwillingly, who hast been my ruin, by forcing me to allow time for calumnies against me, and envy at me. However, I am come hither, and I am ready to hear the evidence there is against me. If I be a parricide, I have passed by land and by sea, without suffering any misfortune on either of them. But this method of trial is no advantage to me, for it seems, O father, that I am already condemned, both before God and before thee. And as I am already condemned, I beg that thou wilt not believe the others that have been tortured, but let fire be brought to torment me, let the racks march through my bowels, have no regard to any lamentations that this polluted body can make, for if I be a parricide, I ought not to die without torture. Thus did Antipater cry out with lamentation and weeping, and moved all the rest, and Varus in particular, to commiserate his case. Herod was the only person whose passion was too strong to permit him to weep, as knowing that the testimonies against him were true. And now it was that, at the king's command, Nicolaus, when he had premised a great deal about the craftiness of Antipater, and had prevented the effects of their commiseration to him, afterwards brought in a bitter and large accusation against him, ascribing all the wickedness that had been in the kingdom to him, and especially the murder of his brethren, and demonstrated that they had perished by the calumnies he had raised against them. He also said that he had laid designs against them that were still alive, as if they were laying plots for the succession. And, said he, how can it be supposed that he who prepared a poison for his father should abstain from mischief as to his brethren? He then proceeded to convict him of the attempt to poison Herod, and gave an account in order of the several discoveries that had been made, and had great indignation as to the affair of Pheroras, because Antipater had been for making him murder his brother, and had corrupted those that were dearest to the king, and filled the whole palace with wickedness. And when he had insisted on many other accusations, and the proofs for them, he left off. Then Varus bid Antipater make his defense, but he lay along in silence, and said no more but this: God is my witness that I am entirely innocent. So Varus asked for the potion, and gave it to be drunk by a condemned malefactor, who was then in prison, who died upon the spot. So Varus, when he had a very private discourse with Herod, and had written an account of this assembly to Caesar, went away after a day's stay. The king also bound Antipater, and sent away to inform Caesar of his misfortunes. Now after this it was discovered that Antipater had laid a plot against Salome also, for one of Antiphilus's domestic servants came, and brought letters from Rome, from a maidservant of Julia, Caesar's wife, whose name was Acme. By her a message was sent to the king, that she had found a letter written by Salome, among Julia's papers, and had sent it to him privately, out of her good will to him. This letter of Salome contained the most bitter reproaches of the king, and the highest accusations against him. Antipater had forged this letter, and had corrupted Acme, and persuaded her to send it to Herod. This was proved by her letter to Antipater, for thus did this woman write to him: As thou desirest, I have written a letter to thy father, and have sent that letter, and am persuaded that the king will not spare his sister when he reads it. Thou wilt do well to remember what thou hast promised when all is accomplished. When this epistle was discovered, and what the epistle forged against Salome contained, a suspicion came into the king's mind, that perhaps the letters against Alexander were also forged. He was moreover greatly disturbed, and in a passion, because he had almost slain his sister on Antipater's account. He did no longer delay therefore to bring him to punishment for all his crimes. Yet when he was eagerly pursuing Antipater, he was restrained by a severe distemper he fell into. However, he sent all accounts to Caesar about Acme, and the contrivances against Salome. He sent also for his testament, and altered it, and therein made Antipas king, as taking no care of Archelaus and Philip, because Antipater had blasted their reputations with him. But he bequeathed to Caesar, besides other presents that he gave him, 1,000 talents, as also to his wife, and children, and friends, and freedmen, about 500. He also bequeathed to all others a great quantity of land, and of money, and showed his respects to Salome his sister, by giving her most splendid gifts. And this was what was contained in his testament, as it was now altered. End of Book 1, chapters 31 and 32. Book 1, Chapter 33 of the Wars of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wars of the Jews by Josephus. Translated by William Whiston. Book 1, Chapter 33. Chapter 33. The golden eagle is cut to pieces. Herod's barbarity when he was ready to die. He attempts to kill himself. He commands Antipater to be slain. He survives him 5 days and then dies. Now Herod's distemper became more and more severe to him, and this because these disorders fell upon him in his old age, and when he was in a melancholy condition, for he was already 70 years of age, and had been brought by the calamities that had happened to him about his children, whereby he had no pleasure in life, even when he was in health. The grief also that Antipater was still alive aggravated his disease, whom he resolved to put to death now not at random, but as soon as he should be well again, and resolved to have him slain in a public manner. There also now happened to him, among his other calamities, a certain popular sedition. There were 2 men of learning in the city, Jerusalem, who were thought the most skilful in the laws of their country, and were on that account held in very great esteem all over the nation. They were, the one Judas, the son of Sepphoris, the other Matthias, the son of Margallus. There was a great concourse of the young men to these men when they expounded the laws, and there got together every day a kind of army of such as were growing up to be men. Now when these men were informed that the king was wearing away with melancholy, and with a distemper, they dropped words to their acquaintance, how it was now a very proper time to defend the cause of God, and to pull down what had been erected contrary to the laws of their country, for it was unlawful there should be any such thing in the temple as images or faces, or the like representation of any animal whatsoever. Now the king had put up a golden eagle over the great gate of the temple, which these learned men exhorted them to cut down, and told them that if there should any danger arise, it was a glorious thing to die for the laws of their country, because that the soul was immortal, and that an eternal enjoyment of happiness did await such as died on that account, while the mean-spirited, and those that were not wise enough to show a right love of their souls, preferred a death by a disease, before that which is the result of a virtuous behavior. At the same time that these men made this speech to their disciples, a rumor was spread about that the king was dying, which made the young men set about the work with greater boldness. They therefore let themselves down from the top of the temple with thick cords, and this at midday, and while a great number of people were in the temple, and cut down that golden eagle with axes. This was presently told to the king's captain of the temple, who came running with a great body of soldiers, and caught about 40 of the young men, and brought them to the king. And when he asked them, first of all, whether they had been so hardy as to cut down the eagle, they confessed that they had done so, and when he asked him by whose command they had done it, they replied, at the command of the law of their country. And when he further asked them how they could be so joyful when they were to be put to death, they replied, because they should enjoy greater happiness after they were dead. [Footnote: Since in these 2 sections we have an evident account of the Jewish opinion in the days of Josephus about a future happy state, the resurrection of the dead, as in the New Testament, John 11:24, I shall here refer to the other places in Josephus, before he became a Catholic Christian, which concern the same matters. Of the war, Book 2, Chapter 8, Section 10-11, Book 3, Chapter 8, Section 4, Book 7, Chapter 6, Section 7. Contra Appian, Book 2, Section 30, where we may observe, that none of these passages are in his books of antiquities, written peculiarly for the use of the Gentiles, to whom he thought it not proper to insist on topics so much out of their way as these were. Nor is this observation to be omitted here, especially on account of the sensible difference we have now before us, in Josephus's reason of the used by the rabbins, to persuade their scholars to hazard their lives for the vindication of God's law against images, by Moses, as well as of the answers those scholars made to Herod, when they were caught, and ready to die for the same. I mean as compared with the parallel arguments and answers represented in the Antiquities. A like difference between Jewish and Gentile notions the reader will find in my notes on Antiquities. See the like also in the case of the 3 Jewish sects in the Antiquities, and compared with this in his Wars of the Jews. nor does St. Paul himself reason to Gentile at Athens, Acts 17:16-34, as he does to Jews in his epistle. At this the king was in such an extravagant passion, that he overcame his disease, for the time, and went out, and spake to the people, wherein he made a terrible accusation against those men, as being guilty of sacrilege, and as making greater attempts under pretense of their law, and he thought they deserved to be punished as impious persons. Whereupon the people were afraid lest a great number should be found guilty, and desired that when he had first punished those that put him upon this work, and then those that were caught in it, he would leave off his anger as to the rest. With this the king complied, though not without difficulty, and ordered those that had let themselves down, together with their rabbins, to be burnt alive, and delivered the rest that were caught to the proper officers, to be put to death by them. After this the distemper seized upon his whole body, and greatly disordered all its parts with various symptoms, for there was a gentle fever upon him, and an intolerable itching all over the surface of his body, and continual pains in his colon, and dropsical turnouts about his feet, and an inflammation of the abdomen, and a putrefaction of his privy member, that produced worms. Besides which he had a difficulty of breathing upon him, and could not breathe but when he sat upright, and had a convulsion of all his members, insomuch that the diviners said these diseases were a punishment upon him for what he had done to the rabbins. Yet did he struggle with his numerous disorders, and still had a desire to live, and hoped for recovery, and considered of several methods of cure. Accordingly he went over Jordan, and made use of those hot baths at Calarho, which ran into the lake asphaltitis, but are themselves sweet enough to be drunk. And here the physicians thought proper to bathe his whole body in warm oil, by letting it down into a large vessel full of oil, whereupon his eyes failed him, and he came and went as if he was dying, and as a tumult was then made by his servants, at their voice he revived again. Yet did he after this despair of recovery, and gave orders that each soldier should have 50 drachma apiece, and that his commanders and friends should have great sums of money given them. He then returned back and came to Jericho, in such a melancholy state of body as almost threatened him with present death, when he proceeded to attempt a horrid wickedness, for he had got together the most illustrious men of the whole Jewish nation, out of every village, into a place called the Hippodrome, and there shut them in. He then called for his sister Salome, and her husband Alexas, and made this speech to them: I know well enough that the Jews will keep a festival upon my death; however, it is in my power to be mourned for on other accounts, and to have a splendid funeral, if you will but be subservient to my commands. Do you but take care to send soldiers to encompass these men that are now in custody, and slay them immediately upon my death, and then all Judea, and every family of them, will weep at it, whether they will or no. These were the commands he gave them, when there came letters from his ambassadors at Rome, whereby information was given that Acme was put to death at Caesar's command, and that Antipater was condemned to die. However, they wrote withal, that if Herod had a mind rather to banish him, Caesar permitted him to do so. So he for a little while revived, and had a desire to live, but presently he was overborne by his pains, and was disordered by want of food, and by a convulsive cough, and endeavored to prevent a natural death. So he took an apple, and asked for a knife, for he used to pare apples and eat them. He then looked round about to see that there was nobody to hinder him, and lift up his right hand as if he would stab himself. But Achebius, his first cousin, came running to him, and held his hand, and hindered him from so doing, on which occasion a very great lamentation was made in the palace, as if the king were expiring. As soon as ever Antipater heard that, he took courage, and with joy in his looks, besought his keepers for a sum of money, to loose him and let him go, but the principal keeper of the prison did not only obstruct him in that his intention, but ran and told the king what his design was. Hereupon the king cried out louder than his distemper would well bear, and immediately sent some of his guards and slew Antipater. He also gave orders to have him buried at Hyrcanium, and altered his testament again, and therein made Archelaus, his eldest son, and the brother of Antipas, his successor, and made Antipas tetrarch. So Herod, having survived the slaughter of his son 5 days, died, having reigned 34 years since he had caused Antigonus to be slain, and obtained his kingdom, but 37 years since he had been made king by the Romans. Now as for his fortune, it was prosperous in all other respects, if ever any other man could be so, since from a private man he obtained the kingdom, and kept it so long, and left it to his own sons; but still in his domestic affairs he was a most unfortunate man. Now before the soldiers knew of his death, Salome and her husband came out and dismissed those that were in bonds, whom the king had commanded to be slain, and told them that he had altered his mind, and would have every one of them sent to their own homes. When these men were gone, Salome told the soldiers the king was dead, and got them and the rest of the multitude together to an assembly in the amphitheater at Jericho, where Ptolemy, who was entrusted by the king with his signet ring, came before them, and spake of the happiness the king had attained, and comforted the multitude, and read the epistle which had been left for the soldiers, wherein he earnestly exhorted them to bear good will to his successor. And after he had read the epistle, he opened and read his testament, wherein Philip was to inherit Trachonitis and the neighboring countries, and Antipas was to be tetrarch, as we said before, and Archelaus was made king. He had also been commanded to carry Herod's ring to Caesar, and the settlements he had made, sealed up, because Caesar was to be lord of all the settlements he had made, and was to confirm his testament, and he ordered that the dispositions he had made were to be kept as they were in his former testament. So there was an acclamation made to Archelaus, to congratulate him upon his advancement, and the soldiers, with the multitude, went round about in troops, and promised him their good will, and besides prayed to God to bless his government. After this they betook themselves to prepare for the king's funeral, and Archelaus omitted nothing of magnificence therein, but brought out all the royal ornaments to augment the pomp of the deceased. There was a bier all of gold, embroidered with precious stones, and a purple bed of various contexture, with the dead body upon it, covered with purple, and a diadem was put upon his head, and a crown of gold above it, and a scepter in his right hand, and near to the bier were Herod's sons, and a multitude of his kindred, next to which came his guards, and the regiment of Thracians, the Germans also, and Gauls, all accounted as if they were going to war, but the rest of the army went foremost, armed, and following their captains and officers in a regular manner, after whom 500 of his domestic servants and freedmen followed, with sweet spices in their hands, and the body was carried 200 furlongs to Herodium, where he had given order to be buried. And this shall suffice for the conclusion of the life of Herod. End of Book 1, Chapter 33. End of Book 1.